Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this very fascinating conference. What I want to tell you today is not so much even work in progress, it's just the beginning of a research project which I have recently started. I have worked on Max Stirner for a while, but I have recently realized that I can make a lot more sense of his work if I read him through the lens of embodiment. So maybe I need to unpack the title a little bit. The term self-empowerment, I think, is primarily the way in which we can understand Stirner as an anarchist in a broad sense, because he focuses on the way that I am complicit in my own oppression by relating to myself in terms of categories like a citizen, a man, or even a human, because he interprets these categories as normative ideals, and by devoting my energies towards adhering to such an ideal, I am making myself miserable, and I'm also helping reconstitute and reinforce the oppressive structures of which these ideals are part. I will refer to them as ideologies in this talk. This is something that needs to be argued, but I don't really have time because I want to talk about these other two things as well, which is embodied egoism. Stirner refers to his thought as egoism, and that has led to him being misinterpreted as a petty bourgeois individualist or as an individualist anarchist at best, and I think it's not a very fruitful way of reading him. And after explaining what I mean by embodied egoism, I want to talk about the possibility of combining Stirner's thought with a consciousness and like a theoretical awareness of the way that the brain works as an interface, both conceptually and actually between mind and matter. I think that confronting Stirner's broadly political self-empowerment with the brain is very interesting and allows us to develop some of the tensions more clearly. So what I was very fascinated when I found the book, What Should We Do with Our Brain? Because it galvanized to me many of the interests I was beginning to combine. And I want to try to answer the question, which culture is the culture of neuronal liberation, by saying that one such culture might be a neuro-anarchism based on Max Stirner's embodied egoism. Neuro-anarchism doesn't really exist yet, so I want to try to figure out how we might build such a concept. So I will give you a very brief crash course on Max Stirner, as short as possible, and then I will talk about two different varieties of embodiment, because I feel that in cognitive science and the recent trends in 4E cognition, but also in the work of Max Stirner, there are two very different ways in which embodiment can be deployed as a concept. Then I will briefly talk about what this means for the debates that Stirner was involved in his time, and then try to point out some trajectories for neuro-anarchism. This is one of two depictions of Stirner that we have today. Both are drawings by Engels. They were good friends in Berlin in the 1840s, and they drank a lot of beer together. With the other young Hegelians, you can see them here on the right. They're engaged in a very heated debate. The chairs and the papers are on the floor already. And this is also a good symbolization of the general discursive context of the young Hegelian debate, which in very short time moved quickly through accelerating critique from the school of Hegelian philosophy towards criticizing religion in favor of humanism, trying to develop materialism as a basis for socialism later in Marx and Engels, and basically the way to argue in this social context was to denounce everyone else as still a pious Christian and then present yourself as very different from everyone else. This is sort of how you recognize them. So important works were Ludwig Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, where he said that the attributes of God really belong to the human species being. He also conceived of this as a materialism. It was very influential, but Stirner criticized Feuerbach, saying that his humanism is just as oppressive as the religion before. Earlier, we thought that the vagabonds and the prostitutes and the poor people are bad Christians. Now we think that they are not realizing their human essence, but they are denigrated in much the same way, and the formal function of this ideology is still the same. And then in the German ideology, Marx would take up most of Stirner's criticism of Feuerbach, but of course the work wasn't published at this point in time, so I put it in square brackets. It will come up later. Some of Stirner's positions are that he rejects religion, humanism, he rejects morality and laws, as abstract norms which are based on a frivolous and false authority, and also which make humans unhappy. He rejects the state and the family also as more or less coercive institutions which do not help us in the pursuit of happiness. And he seeks to throw off ideology through insurrection. So he says that if we have a revolution and everyone is the same person they were the day before, we will have gained very little. And we need to instead work on the way we relate to ourselves in order to become different, in order to be able to really change anything. He avoids essentialism by using the term unique one. In German, the title of his only book is Der Einzige und sein Eigentum. It's often translated as ego, which really doesn't help because it's pre-Freudian and the terminology doesn't really match up. You can call it unique one. And the idea is not to talk about a citizen or a human or a man, but instead to use a term that doesn't have any normative content. And this anti-essentialism is also why people have read him together with post-structuralist anarchism, which is something I worked on as well, but I was not really satisfied with it, and I think the notion of embodiment can help us move beyond this. He dissolves and posits himself at every moment as a creative nothingness, which is sort of hard to make sense of, and I think that thinking about the brain can also help us there later. And his idea of sociality is the voluntary association, which he calls union of egoists. He has a very strong focus on the transitory nature of social interaction, so he says that a union only exists through the active participation of the people involved. As soon as you stop actively uniting with your fellow humans, or your fellow unique ones, I should say, the union is over. Mostly he has been misread, and there are different ways of doing this. So the easiest one is to say, he talks about property and egoism, so you think that he's sort of an economic libertarian or individualist. People say he's a petit bourgeois obsessed with legal ownership. Even anarchists sometimes publish stuff like this, who could theoretically know better. But what he means by property is not legal ownership, because he rejects laws. He says your world extends as far as your capacity. What you grasp is your own simply because you grasp it. And grasp here means both intellectually and also with your hand, just reaching out and taking it. People think he's an individualist who favors competition over mutual aid. That's not actually what he means by egoism. He means by egoism a consciousness of the way we exist towards the world. He means not forgetting that the world is ours, not forgetting that we are the center and owner of the world, that it is our property. So what we've gained now is that we know, and these two quotes are from an article he wrote to reply to his critics, where he clarified his position, and this makes it clear that he's not a petit bourgeois economic individualist, but it does sound a little bit like he's a megalomaniac. It sounds very subjectivist. I'm the center of the world. I'm the owner of the world. It's difficult to make sense of this, and I think it helps a lot to compare it to other thinkers in terms of embodiment, and there are two varieties here, subjective and somatic embodiment. The subject is the first one I want to talk about, and there's a very interesting theoretical biologist called Jakob von Uexküll. He was one of the few and early people to take seriously the inner life of animals, we might say, or the fact that an animal lives inside a world of subjective experience. He describes it like a bubble. Every animal lives in a bubble, which is its Umwelt, and the structure of the Umwelt is determined by the nervous system of the animal, by the body of the animal. So most animals can't see as many colors as we can, so their Umwelt doesn't have the same colors as ours. And every individual organism lives in their own subjective world. Likewise, I think the work of Merleau-Ponty can help us a lot here. He says, I'm not a living creature, nor even a man, nor again even a consciousness endowed with all the characteristics that science can explain. I am the absolute source. And he says that his gaze basically spans open the horizon, and much in this way, all the senses, not really the physical senses, but all his sensory experience spans open the world that he lives in. It's even significant, I find, that he writes in the first person singular, like Stirner. It's also something that is noteworthy. So both Uexküll and Merleau-Ponty describe subjective experience in a way that is similar to Stirner's as being towards the world, one might say. For both of them, experience has a sort of existential primacy for the subject, and they both assert that the structure of experience is closely linked to the structure of the organism, of the actual body. So Merleau-Ponty he looks a lot at studies of nerve damage, for example, and the way this changes the way we experience the world. And Uexküll is a sort of proto-cybernetician who talks about feedback loops between the nervous system and the environment. So interesting. And what's interesting about Stirner is that he identifies ideology not just as an obstacle in our consciousness that prevents us from realizing our exploitation economically and our oppression politically, but also ideology is something that prevents us from realizing the way we exist towards the world in this pseudo-phenomenological sense, you might say. And to me, this is, at this point, our awareness of the brain comes in. So far, it was sort of a new reading of Stirner, but if we add consciousness of the brain, we can think about this in a different way, because the plasticity of our brain also means that the structure of our Umwelt, the structure of our experience, can be changed along with the structure of our brain. And if we take ownership of our own brain, we thereby also take ownership and empower ourselves to shape the world we live in, the world we experience to some degree. The somatic side of embodiment is very interesting in Stirner. He describes how ideology works on us through the body. He describes a young woman who gets horny, and then her cheeks get flushed and her limbs tense, and then she's reminded by herself that masturbation is a sin, presumably, and she gets afraid for her soul. The blood leaves her face. She gets very still, calm, and pale. So there's not just the link here between ideology and libidinal desire that we know later from psychoanalysis, but it's routed through the body. Luckily, also our struggle against ideology works through the body. Stirner says that with a shrug of his shoulders and with a joyous whoop, he can throw off the nightmare of the religious world, and religious world in this sense is formally contiguous with humanism and liberalism. So the self-subjugation of individuals under ideology is not just libidinal but profoundly somatic, and likewise our insurrection against ideology is not an intellectual affair but a willful bodily activity. Here again I feel like the brain comes in as a very interesting interface between this bodily activity that is also observable from the outside, and on the other hand, the subjective experience of the Umwelt we live in. This is basically what I understand by embodied egoism. So what does this new way of reading Stirner mean for his disagreements? One point that's interesting is that Feuerbach, as a reply to Stirner's book, where Stirner said, I am a human, but that's just an attribute, I am more than human, it doesn't define me. Feuerbach said, are you also more than a man? Isn't your brain the most sacred and elevated organ of your body, definitely masculine? And here we have an intersection of two normative ideals. The brain is the truth of the self, and also gender is the truth of the self. And Wolfgang Esbach has written about how Stirner rejects the notion that gender is sort of a fate, is the truth of a self that we cannot go beyond, because Stirner says he doesn't care what true masculinity is, which is very interesting in the 1840s, very early critical position on gender. But if we now think about the brain, and we think back to what Feuerbach says, the fact that the brain is not determinist, the fact that the brain is plastic and not our fate, is the reason why Stirner's move is effective. If the brain was not plastic, and if we couldn't work on the brain, then Feuerbach's argument would hold a lot more water than it does, and Stirner's rejection would be a mere speech act, but we can actually work on our brain, and it's not a determinist fate. One thing that's also interesting is the conflict between ideology and material relations, or based in superstructure, in the German ideology, where Marx and Engels denounced the other young Hegelians by saying that all this criticism of abstract concepts is really not that useful because the working class doesn't even believe in these things in the first place. Summarizing it, one might say that they believe that critique of ideology is only in our heads and is not out there in the real world, but the brain helps us realize that what is in our head is in fact material. It shapes the way we act in the world, it shapes the way we perceive the world. So ideology has material reality in the brain, which sort of opens up this dialogue maybe, or possibility for dialogue, because even though they used Stirner's criticism of Feuerbach, they were very focused on expelling him from historical materialism, which they then invented. And in the Theses on Feuerbach, Marx says that we need a sensuous, not just contemplative materialism, and yet there seems to be a tendency in different stages of Marxism and also other forms of materialism to exclude subjective experience, all the way from Lenin to Churchland. There are very interesting structural parallels in the way that Lenin argues against Mach, Marx against Stirner, and then also the debates around the naturalization of phenomenology are sort of more diffuse but similar in some respects. So how could we build a neuroanarchism? 3 different topics here. We want to do, what should we do with our brain? What would it even look like to do something with our brain is a question we might ask. Francisco Varela took seriously Merleau-Ponty to some degree, and he said that we should use systematic analysis of subjective experience of test subjects in neuroimaging studies to guide our interpretation of the data, because he realizes that there's this structural link between the structure of experience and the structure of what we can see in the brain. Now, what I want to do is reverse this relation, and by experiencing the world differently, by having different meaningful experiences in the present situation, we can work back on our brain, and the way we experience the world will shape our brains. And what I use for this, or want to use, is Gestalt therapy, which is basically a focus on the present, and Gestalt formation. You know it visually as different parts of a triangle, for example, forming a meaningful whole, but you can also talk about objects and processes and subjects in your surroundings, which you have to integrate into a meaningful Gestalt. And if you don't have a preconceived meaning or a preconceived idea of what the purpose or the essence of the people and the objects around you are able to combine them in a spontaneous and joyful manner, which is prevented by ideology and fixed meanings for the elements that could form a Gestalt, basically. Also, the process of Gestalt formation is referred to as actual genesis, which is interesting because it focuses on the present, like Stirner, and it's distinct from philo or ontogenetic processes. And Marx focuses a lot on the latter two, which means that he doesn't really talk about what Stirner is doing. We also have to think more about what the material status of ideology in the brain could really look like, and it's instructive here to see the many ways in which Paul Churchland is wrong about eliminative materialism. Now, I won't go into these 3 different ways, but the fact is that if ideology is how we relate to the world, it is also material reality in our brains. It's not just a wrong representation, but it's a false representation that becomes neural reality through our use. And it's not enough to realize that it's wrong. We have to actively unlearn these false maps and start exploring the territory. And here Alfred Korzybski helps us, because his notion of general semantics is sort of like a generalization of Stirner's critique of language. And also Korzybski already in the 1930s conceived of these false representations as false pathways in the brain. It's very interesting, and a very early use of the brain as a critical site of struggle, one might say, even though Korzybski is not political, but we can use his theories. And a last point that's interesting is how to make sense of creative nothingness, because it doesn't really link up to the way we perceive the natural world very, very neatly. And in the 19th century, a determinist position on why humans do what they do would have been way more compatible with the view of the natural sciences. Now we have non-deterministic, or at least we have surprising or probabilistic processes in physics and in history with Prigozhin and Stengers or with Wallerstein, and I believe that similarly we might look towards the natural sciences to see also processes on the level of the individual or of the level of the singularity, which are not predetermined and which do not use mechanisms that are predetermined. I don't know whether I have time to explain this. There's an interesting research about bacteria which gained the ability to digest food that they weren't able to digest before, not through a mechanism that is preformed, but by the probabilistic bumping into each other of molecules inside the cell, basically. And this is called adaptive improvisation, and the citation is, the mechanism is there is no mechanism. So it's not, of course, this doesn't prove that creative nothingness is real, but it allows us to think about what Stirner says in a way that has at least some conceptual parallels to notions from the natural sciences, and I think that's very interesting to investigate this further. So what I did was a new reading of Stirner as embodied, which gives us a different awareness of what his positions entail, and we could maybe use this to develop a different kind of materialism. Probably different kinds of materialism also exist, which I'm not aware of, and some of them are probably close to what I want to do. But in relation to Stirner, this is new. And then I gave some different avenues for what to do in terms of neuroanarchism. These are my references, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Pathway forward. Completely agree.
Just a quick mention of Paul Goodman's connection with Gestalt psychology. Paul Goodman, well-known American anarchist, post-war period, who was I think, actually part of the group that developed Gestalt therapy and tied it to his anarchism.
I should really read his other work because
Paul Goodman.
Thank you so much. Actually, this is the book called Gestalt Therapy, Excitement and Growth in the Human Personality, which is my main reference in this direction, and it's written by Frederick Perls, Ralph Hefferlein, and Paul Goodman. So yeah, thank you. But I forgot to look more into his anarchist work. Yeah. Thank you.
I have just a short comment or suggestion. I think, even though I understand why you are starting with phonic skills conception, you may find a better theoretical platform for developing your argument, because the problem with each skills concept of Umwelt is that it is static. We believed that the Umwelt is given once for all, and it was Kurt Goldstein who subjected phonic skills conception to quite heavy and for me convincing criticism. Suggesting that our world is not and cannot be static, for it is always exposed to certain contingency. It's trembling. It's always exposed to the catastrophic situations. And I think, considering that Goldstein was also one of the fathers of Gestalt, I think that this would be much more useful platform or a basis for your argument.
Thank you. That's a very helpful suggestion. Of course, I will have to not adopt the conception of Umwelt precisely the way that Uexküll uses it. Another point where I depart from maybe not him, but the people who preface his books is that many people are very set on emphasizing that the notion of Umwelt doesn't apply to humans. I read a German edition from 50 years ago, and then there's a new one from 2010 in English, and the introductions are very different, but they are very similar in the way that they staunchly oppose the idea that you can apply this notion to humans, but I think you can if you change it in such a way that it becomes dynamic and changeable, like you mentioned. But also the idea, of course, of brain plasticity already implies this, if you take seriously the structural link between the organism and the subjective Umwelt. But thank you.
This actually brings me to another point. Since I've already mentioned Goldstein, I wonder whether Catherine sees some connection between her concept of trauma and Goldstein's concept of catastrophic situation.
I don't know. I'm sorry. No. I haven't read that. I know him through what Heidegger says about life and the world, animals' world, but I don't know about the catastrophe. But it was very, very interesting. Thank you. Could you specify more the relationship you see between the brain and anarchism? When you talk about the neuro.
Yeah. That's a broad and somewhat difficult question, of course, because I'm at the moment exploring different avenues or directions in which this might go. I guess really the starting point for me was the realization of how the brain changes the way we think about the relationship between mind and matter, or the relationship between base and superstructure, one might say as well. It was in the reasons why Marx rejects Stirner. They are modified very severely if you bring the brain into this discussion, and it's.
What does Marx say about the brain?
It's not the brain isn't in this discussion specifically, but it's the idea that ideology is apart from material processes, and if the brain sort of links them back together. It's also not there are very different positions within the work of Marx and Engels on the brain. There's some interesting things I've been made aware of in Engels about the development of the cognitive faculties based on how we manipulate the world with our hands, but I haven't really had the opportunity to look into that more.
Are we talking about self-organizing systems with emergent properties? Yeah. I mean, there's a question of what exactly that kind of dynamic relationship is to political anarchism. Like lack of central coordinating cybernetic authority is perhaps a necessary but not sufficient condition, in the sense that we find roughly horizontal self-organizing systems also in, let's say, far-right networks.
Or even management.
Or capitalist management, right. So there's I think, but again, that's one of the places where, right, okay, so are we looking for something that is like a property of systems in a very kind of deep way in order to appeal to in our support of anarchist politics, or is that a self-defeating gesture?
That's the ambiguous relationship between anarchism and biology. And it's necessary and at the same time ambiguous.
Yeah. That's an interesting field of tension, certainly also the different applications of the idea of self-organization, both on the level of a social group and also in terms of conceiving of the individual as a self-organizing system. And I definitely want to look more into approaches in biology of conceiving the agency or the selfhood of individual organisms. I think there's interesting work there which I haven't yet had the time to delve into. Certainly promising but also problematic combinations of these concepts abound, and I'm very excited about looking further into that. I don't really have a solution or answer to anything yet.
I can't help but being reminded of the three metamorphoses of spirit in Zarathustra. Does that ring a bell at all? To anybody?
The camel, the lion, and the child.
Right, the child, right? The creative sense, so post-ideology, so there's a certain sense of optimism here, right? And maybe discard ideology, the heaviness of history, right? Of course, that spirit of gravity, Christianity, with the focus on pity, right? Or the shame response. You actually have Stirner was right, in terms of the woman's exploration of sexuality and the realization, oh, I'm not supposed to do that. And she fell, in terms of the bodily reaction, right into a shame response, right? That psychiatrists tell us, right? So it wasn't so much in the end, it feels like being guilty, but it's really a shame response, and that attacks the essence of the person rather than focusing on specific behaviors, right? But so I'm just wondering if, you talk about the life of bacteria, maybe we'll talk about the life of children self-actualizing and, giving us another version of
I think it's
anarchism,
I think it's very interesting to look at socialization of children, and also in terms of the idea of a detached scientific observer, because the problem that scientific or scientifically inflected materialism has with explaining subjective experience, to me, seems to stem from a very systematic social aversion against a consciousness of embodiment. It's almost as if it begins by telling children to sit still and to only relate to each other and to the situation intellectually and not bodily. You are basically training people to deny and forget about their own embodiment. And I feel like there's a connection here between it feeds back into very abstract conceptual issues in how a certain worldview is constructed. But again, I would need to work on this more.
So there's our end against somatophobia. And,